This is going to be for hockey players. We're going to talk about some of the things to consider if you are a hockey player looking to possibly get into real estate. I've created a slide deck here. Let's jump right into this. So overall, real estate for hockey players, and I will go through everything, and I'll also attach a QR code at the end if you wanted to discuss your own personal situation later. We can definitely unpack that at any time. Let's jump right into the agenda. So, quick introduction. We'll talk about the market a little bit. We'll talk about four concepts for hockey players, and I've created these specifically for hockey players, and you'll see why very shortly. We're going to talk about a little bit about building your team, but we won't get too much into that for today. Same with timeline. We'll see how we're doing from a time perspective, but overall, let's break down these concepts and what they mean for you. Now, I am Michael Ouzas. I am a realtor here in the city of Toronto. I am licensed for all of Ontario, and I did play 13 years professional hockey, which many of you, maybe if you know me as a realtor, might not know that that was my past career. And if we did meet through hockey, then of course you know that that's what I used to do for a long time. Now I've been in real estate for half a decade now, which is great. It's been a really good transition. But overall, the reason for this video is while I was playing, I purchased multiple properties along the way, and that gave me the ability to make future moves after I retired. So if I wouldn't have done that while I was playing, I would have definitely been, or at least felt like I was a bit behind the eight ball, especially in a city like Toronto once I retired. So something that I'm very passionate about is helping the hockey community and discussing my journey and how I made that work and trying to share that knowledge because I was very fortunate enough that people that I knew growing up, and especially my father and mother who are very much in real estate, they helped me get into that. I do have an extensive network outside of the Greater Toronto area, basically North America wide, and kind of expanding into Europe as players that I used to play with are now doing real estate in Europe as well. So we are pretty big network, hockey player wide across the globe, which is awesome to see. Real estate is a great profession if anyone's looking to get into that after retiring. Let's jump into a bit of housekeeping because this is so important when we talk about this real estate concepts. Definitely all concepts are player dependent, and everyone has different rules between provinces, states, countries, different rules on mortgages, rent restrictions, the closing timelines. We do have foreign buyer rules in Canada right now, especially uh, if you are a foreign buyer or you don't, or maybe you're Canadian, but you don't file residency in Canada. That's something else to consider. So taxes, all that kind of stuff. It's important to get the right team of people that can help you navigate that and ask you the right questions so that you know exactly what to expect when the time comes to if you're making a purchase or what you're thinking of doing. And I got to say, there is some work involved. So if you are purchasing, and we'll talk about kind of the pros and cons of each concept, but generally, if you're purchasing something and you're going to be renting it out at some point, this is a business. It is a business perspective when it comes time to being a landlord or just getting the property ready to go. So there is some work involved. I'll unpack all of that and a little bit of fine print. This is definitely for educational purposes only. This is not financial advice, not to solicit or breach any contracts with other realtors, anything like that. I seriously am just doing this seminar, webinar to give back to the hockey community. It's given me so much in my life. And I feel like if I would have learned this knowledge while I was playing, it would have been something that would have definitely helped me a lot. So that's why I do have this platform on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, LinkedIn, all the elements there. Figured I would just put it out there so that others can hopefully learn and maybe get a nugget or two or something they can learn from. Let's talk about this hockey player cycle. And it's so amazing when you really think about it. And I'm looking back now and I'm like, wow, this is a little bit different than what I'm currently doing here in the city of Toronto. But the old hockey player life cycle, basically, we have two seasons. There's an in season and off season. And if you've lived this life, you know it all too well. Essentially, if we talk about in season, you're moving to a new city, you're unpacking your entire life in that city. You go undergo training camp. You're either making that team or you might get shipped off to a new team, or it's a new team altogether and you're just trying to find a place to live, build your routine. You have your regular season, you have your playoffs. If you're playing, for example, in Europe and typically contracts are generally 1, 2, or maybe you might get lucky and get a 3 year. Overall, probably negotiating a new contract, and then you're packing up your entire life again. You're flying back and or driving back for the off season, and that's the in-season part of it, and we make it look like clockwork when we do this year in and year out. When I was playing, of course, it just kind of felt like that was the norm, and you just kind of get used to it. So it's interesting looking at it from a bird's eye view now after retiring. And we talk about the off season. Generally, it's where to live. That's the first question. Most players, you might end up moving back with your parents. You might be living with friends. You might find your own rental, or if we'll talk about these concepts, you might move into a place that you own. So, finding out where to live, finding a place to train and skate, if you have all that set up, you might want to be close to where those are in the summertime. You're trying to balance your life with your family, your friends. You have either a new contract, current contract, prep for camp, pack for your entire life again, or pack up your entire life again, and drive back for in season. When in this cycle, it just seems like you don't really know any different. And the off season is 3, 4 to 5 months. The in season is the rest of the year, and basically rinse and repeat until you're done. So it's something to really enjoy. And that is a big reason why I decided to piece all this together and make this video. If we talk about real estate, and this of course is I'm a realtor. We're going to talk real estate specific for this video. Real estate is long-term thinking. And the way I always think about it is if you're looking to have a 10-year career or 10-year pro career, that could equal 10 years of real estate. And it might not seem like that when you're playing, but 10 years in real estate is a long time. If I look back at the last basically 13 years of real estate overall, back to 2012, which seems like forever ago, but it was about 13 years ago, there was all this talk about Toronto real estate, Canadian real estate, housing booms, housing bubbles, housing rebounds. All of these elements have been into play for as long as I can remember. And there's another video on my channel that talks about how I regret selling my first condo. And a lot of that, I mean, I remember these articles at the time, and it's kind of interesting looking back at that. But if we look at overall at the Canadian benchmark price, and we'll also use Vancouver and Toronto here, they are the two most popular markets in Canada, of course. If we look at 20 years of real estate, and we can use 10 if we want to use for the example, essentially overall, prices have done quite well over time. We did have a bit of a peak of the market here in February 2022, which is 3 years ago from now. So and everyone says the peak, that kind of has come and gone. Like we're 3 years removed from that. But overall, if we look at where prices were in 2005 to 2015, and then from 2015 to 2025, this went up to the end of December just for the sake of this video. But overall, prices have increased a pretty decent amount. This red line is in Canada, this orange line is in Toronto, and the blue line is in Vancouver. For Toronto, and we'll speak to that specifically, in Toronto overall, typically prices have increased around 6.7% a year for the last 40 years. Toronto's pretty, that's not a huge number when you really think about it. But overall, it's just a consistent number. And that's 40 years of data, which equates to prices essentially have pretty much doubled over the last 10 years across the board. If you have a 10-year career in pro hockey, 10 years of real estate returns could be pretty beneficial over time. And again, this is not like a financial advice thing. This is just pure data from the Toronto Real Estate Board. If you have a 10-year career in pro hockey, the price to purchase at the end of your career will most likely be more than it is today. And that's kind of the point that I wanted to discuss here, is that generally, if we look 10 years out from now in 2035, which feels like an eternity away from now, prices will most likely be more expensive then than they are today. If we even go from a conservative approach, we're looking at 2 or 3% to 5% a year overall conservatively. And that's where I do think I prefer to be more conservative, especially when it comes to real estate. But that's kind of in general, even still in 10 years, it should do pretty well over that time. The other piece of this is that Toronto rents have generally increased 4 to 5% a year in Toronto. Now, This past year, they've actually gone down a little bit. So we've seen about an 8% decrease in rent. But overall, prices have remained pretty solid in the last basically 5 to 10 years. And in general, they do increase pretty moderately. Now, there are some new rules coming into effect when it comes to rentals, or there's rules in place, rent control and things like that. And we don't know how those will change with things like elections coming up. But overall, over time, rents have also generally increased, kind of in and around, maybe not quite inflation marks, depending on where inflation is, but usually around anywhere between, let's say, 3 to 5% a year. There's some things that we talk about when it comes to major cities, and I'll speak to Toronto because that's where I do business, but similar conversations in areas like Vancouver, Calgary, all the major markets in Canada, and most likely the major markets in the US. In those major cities with prime locations, you generally have a pretty solid rental market. Seasonality. So in Toronto real estate, for example, the warmer months do bring about more competition. And fully furnished rentals are usually difficult to find. They're premium priced and they have various term lengths as well. So, all those factors are super important to consider when looking at the rental market. Let's talk about the concepts for hockey players. And there are four that really stand out to me. When putting together this webinar, I was thinking, how can I present this in a way that would make sense for kind of everybody? And it kind of came down to four concepts that I feel stand out more than any others. First up is the property where you want to live in your off season. So where you're training. The next one is property where you're playing in season. Now, if you're playing in somewhere like Europe, it might not be feasible or doable to maybe purchase where you're living, but could be an option. If you're playing it, for example, if you're playing in Toronto, possibly purchasing where you're considering playing during the season. Property in a city where you don't live in, so maybe purchasing somewhere that you don't live in at all, so off season or while playing, or property for the future. And we'll talk a little bit about pre-construction, even though it hasn't had the best rap as of late, but we'll still discuss that because it is something to consider, something that'll be completed in 4 to 5 years from now. Now, there are 10 common traits across the four concepts. And I know there's a lot of writing on this slide, but we'll go through each one individually. Essentially, when it comes to common traits, and I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit. Planning and preparation is number one. That is the key. That's the key for all of it. We think about real estate. We kind of have a similar approach. If you're planning and preparing like you would for a game, for example, real estate's kind of similar. We want to make sure we plan and prepare so that we try to get a lot of the boxes checked and get all the ducks in a row before going down this venture. So that way it's a doable thing. Location, location, location. This is tried and true in real estate. There's three things that are really important. So one, we want to make sure that it's something that could be rentable, something that could be livable, and something that in the future could be sellable. Now, again, as mentioned earlier, it's case by case, player dependent. Everyone's situation is very different. And this also might not be your forever home. So if you are looking to make a purchase in real estate while you're playing, it might not be the home that you end up retiring in and staying in forever. It may be a stepping stone to that next property. And something, in my case, for example, the first condo I purchased, I ended up selling probably about a few years later, and that turned into a bigger property over time. And then that property, after a few years, turned into another bigger property. So kind of moving up that ladder, but starting it earlier while I was still playing. Now, if you are looking to purchase a rental, maybe hiring a property manager or somebody local who can help to manage that property while away, and you want to time your purchase with your season. So what that means is, for example, if now we're in February, if you are looking to make a move for the summer, starting that process sooner than later so that when you arrive home in the summer and you're looking to make a purchase, then you're home and you can check out properties in person. Or if you're looking to make a move for next season, then you can get those things in a row, get those ducks in a row during the summer so that you can make that purchase to close going into the season so everything's all settled. So you want to make that timing work with your season. If you are looking for a short-term rental, there's so many rules coming into play, and City of Toronto definitely has some short-term rental rules. So that's certainly something that you need to know. Uh, and then foreign buyer rules, purchasing rules, of course, depending on where you're living, where you're looking to buy. One of the things that I found held true with all the properties that I purchased and either turned them into long-term rentals or short-term rentals was most of the heavy lifting is done in year one. So getting it all set up, if you are furnishing it, getting all the furniture in there, getting everything organized, maybe you're painting the walls, doing a little refresh. Most of the heavy lifting is typically done in year one. And overall, number 10, as mentioned before, there's some work involved. It is a business. If you are running a rental property while you're away, there's some work involved to make sure that you have all the people in place or all the elements in place to really be able to manage that as best as possible well in your season, that it won't take away from any of the headaches while you're trying to play. We're starting number one concept, property where you want to live in the off season. And there's a few things that I think stand out when it comes to finding a property for where you want to live in the off season. The first one is that it's typically less contract dependent. If you're from Toronto, but maybe you play in another city or you're another country for that matter, whether you're signing a new contract year after year or you have a long-term contract, if you're purchasing for where you want to live in the off season, this is, for example, your home or maybe where you want to settle in the future, it's generally less contract dependent because if you're coming back to Toronto, for example, then you're always just coming back to Toronto in the off seasons. Doesn't matter where your contracts take you. And if you are living here in the off season, you typically know the city and areas you may want to purchase. You want to you want a place to move in every off season. And this is something that I think kind of flies under the radar. But if you're able to purchase something that you're going to live in the off season, you can just move home and move into that property and not have to deal with finding a short term rental or anything like that. It is definitely something that makes things a little bit easier in the off season. Now, and I say this, I laugh a little bit, but as hockey players, you know that we always are looking for storage to store stuff. And having a furnished property is, I always called it a bit of a hack for storage because you can put your stuff in that property and make it look really nice, but then you don't have to move the furniture come the off season. You could just rent it out fully furnished in a city like Toronto, for example. So I always call it like storage for furniture, as you don't need to keep moving it. And you can also rent that property at a premium if you are looking to rent it out while you're away. And if you are in a city, a major city like that does have another team, for example, if you could rent it here in Toronto to other players that are coming here for their season if you're moving away for the off season. So definitely something that could work. That obviously the timelines of the seasons are generally in check, and you can rent it out medium term, fully furnished, all inclusive, charge a premium there. And it's certainly a great option if you are kind of renting it out to other players, and then you can move away during your season, move back in when they move out for their off season. Now, another thing to discuss is if it's somewhere where you eventually want to live after hockey, you already have a place to live. And that's something that I didn't really put a lot of weight into when I was playing. I didn't even think about it. But when I ended up retiring and I had no more contracts after that, I already had my property purchased and I was able to just move in and live. And I didn't have to go and try to find somewhere to live or find a rental or anything like that. Essentially, I just was able to move in once I moved home. So that is something to consider if it's where you want to live after hockey. And the nice thing about doing these medium term, fully furnished, all inclusive rentals is generally you can charge market value rent each and every season, and it resets between all tenants at the moment. Now, if we take a look at some of the, let's call it the negatives when purchasing or somewhere to live in the off season, or things to consider, let's keep it at that. You will be managing that property from a distance in season. That's where maybe a property manager can come into play if you don't want to deal with those phone calls. But if you are capable of making those calls, and we have a roster of people, for example, that you can find your plumbers, your electricians, whatever's needed, snow removal companies, definitely something that someone can help you navigate or manage it if you need to. And it does take some time to get organized, even though the off season is short. So you may be spending a good portion of your off season setting up these properties to get them ready for when you're leaving in the season. You might not be able to enjoy it as much for your off season. You still have to find furniture during season. So if you live in Toronto, for example, in the off season, then you're moving to, I don't know, for example, across the country to go play somewhere else or down to the US and you need to buy furniture there, you still have to find furniture for in season. So something to consider. And you'll also need to factor in timing the rental agreement so that that schedule lines up with your off season. If you're renting out to maybe a player on another team and their team goes deep in the playoffs and your team doesn't, for example, something to consider if their off season is longer than yours or vice versa, just from the timing. And you will have more turnover year after year going this route. But it is an option to consider and just wanted to bring up some of the items to consider when it comes to that. Concept number two is purchasing a property where you're playing. And that's something that is not as common as generally, unless players have longer contracts, they'll consider this. But it could also be something where if you did it and then purchased in a city like Toronto, for example, you know that there's teams here, you know that you're able to probably get connections to those teams to get properties for the players looking for them even if you're not living here full time or if you move on from this team and now you have connections with the management, you could continue to own that property and they'll still be able to rent it out to other players after you're gone. There are some key factors here. One nice thing about purchasing where you're playing is then you have a place to live right away and it gives you that comfort. So if you are renting something and then, for example, the landlord says, hey, it's time to sell or the place is not available the next year, you'll be bouncing around every year or every other year kind of thing, finding a new place. So if you have your place, you have that comfort of where you can live every season. You don't have to find a new place to live every season with the team. So those two are the big factors. The team coordinator can connect players to the property in the future if you change teams or get traded, or if you are open to house hacking, possibly purchasing a property, having players rent out the basement or other rooms in the property, or if you're, for example, buying a 2-bedroom condo, you can have a roommate pay half your mortgage kind of thing, because it will be cheaper for them to pay you a big portion of your mortgage than for them to go find a 1-bedroom condo on their own. So that is something definitely consider. And it could lower your cost from the property and pay down some of that equity. And you could rent it short term in the off season when you're away, especially in major cities like Toronto. There's always people coming to town for short periods of time, especially in the summertime. So it could be an option there. Just be mindful of the short term rental rules. And we do have some here in the city of Toronto if it's not your primary residence. Now, there are some things to consider if you're buying a property for during the season where you're playing, buying an off season, organizing for during the season in that city. So your window is generally relatively small. So if you are looking to purchase, for example, in Toronto, I keep using Toronto as just an easy example. Then if you're purchasing, you'll most likely be purchasing for the summertime so that it's ready for during the season. And of course, it's contract dependent. So if you do get traded or moved or not re-signed, then you will have a property in a city that you might no longer be playing in. Now, renting it to a teammate or charging rent or raising rent each year, I bring that up as something to consider because it might not be something that you want to do. If you have a great roommate and maybe it's a little bit difficult to have that conversation that you're raising the rent the next year, even though other costs are going up year after year, it could be a bit of something of consideration for sure. Now, you could be buying at a province or state, and there could be some taxes, some income considerations that you also want to check in with your financial planners or accounting department. And you have to find somewhere to live during the off season. So short-term furnished, getting tougher to find, expensive. So if you, for example, are playing in a city like Toronto, but you spend your off seasons out west or out east kind of thing, then you'll be finding somewhere in your off season to live, same kind of thing as vice versa. And you typically might not know the city area if you're coming to a city that's new for you. That's where I will definitely recommend working with somebody local to those cities. And I could definitely help connect you to different agents in whatever market. And that way you know exactly what the city is, what the area is like, and where the best places to be are, especially if you're looking to rent or buy in the city, like, for example, Toronto. I did do a video specifically for hockey players that talks about the best areas to purchase or to live in the city of Toronto. Because if you pick the wrong area, or I wouldn't call it a wrong area, but if you pick an area that you're driving for an hour and a half to get to the practice rink every day because of traffic, something to most definitely consider. And there are different areas for schools and things to definitely consider if you have a family. And in that video, we also talked about like areas to live in if you're a single or you're a couple or if you're a family. And if the other consideration is that if it's not where you eventually want to live after hockey, you will most likely be looking for a place at that time. But one of the caveats to that is if you have this property for many years, maybe you can sell it. And if it does increase in value over that time, you can take that equity and purchase what you want in the area that you want. Number three on the list, purchasing in a property where you don't live in off season or while playing. And this is something to consider most definitely, and it could be a more affordable. A city like Toronto, Vancouver, we are the two most expensive markets in Canada. Or if you're thinking of any other major markets in North America, purchasing in a city where you don't live in, so maybe you're purchasing outside of the major centers, could be more affordable. And it still is an entry into real estate, which could be great long term. Now, depending on what that city is, you could be purchasing, for example, down somewhere like Arizona, where they allow short term rentals at the moment. That could be a potential idea. And the other piece of this is that we could also consider this maybe like a vacation rental. So maybe it's somewhere that you don't live in season or off season, but if you did want to get away on a golf trip or something like that, then you could just jump out to somewhere like Arizona. You got a place to stay. And you can also rent those properties long term, of course, and still gives you that upside in equity over time, especially if you're looking to keep it long term. Some of the things to consider is that you'll be managing this property from a distance full time. So that's in season and off season. It'll always be a full time managing from a distance. Now, you most likely will probably want to consider a property manager if that's the case, just to make it a little bit easier to navigate as you go. You'll want to plan to check in every single year. So if it is a nice place where maybe you can golf a little bit, plan to go and visit every year to make sure everything looks good and everything is going as planned. You typically might not know the area or city, as mentioned in the last on the last concept. Similar kind of story. You want to work with someone who's local, who knows the area and city, to really be able to help you navigate what those markets look like. Always keep in mind location. And I put this in there because there's other markets outside of the major cities. For example, if you're looking in maybe Toronto, you can go 2 hours away and find a nice property that will be significantly cheaper. But if you don't quite have that location in that area, or if transit to the city of Toronto is important consideration, you still want to make sure you find the best location in those cities, because location holds true in any market. And short-term rental rules, you want to know those in whatever city you're looking to explore. Now, out of this number four, property for the future. And there's been so much chat about pre-construction properties, especially in the city of Toronto. A lot of them didn't end up selling that well last year. And in 2024 anyway, it was probably one of the lowest sale, or was the lowest amount of sales pre-construction wide for a long, long time. Now, the reason being is a lot of the pre-construction sales are with future pricing. And what that means is if you're looking to purchase today, for example, a condo that's already built and on the market, there's about a 40% premium to purchase the pre-construction right now. So if all things are equal and you have one condo on one side of the street and the other one's new on the other side of the street, it will cost you 40% more dollars per square foot to purchase that property. So if one's listed at 1 million, the one across the street will be at 1.4 million as an example, an easy math example. So that's where the sales didn't really take off last year. If the prices start to get more in line with the ones that are currently on the market, like things were probably about 5 to 10 years ago, then maybe not five, but certainly 10 years ago, then it may make a little more sense. But it is something to consider regardless, especially if you're considering something for after you're retired and looking somewhere to move in 5 to 10 years. The one nice thing about purchasing pre-construction properties is the extended deposit structure. So generally, they end up being built in 3 to 5 years, especially a condo, for example. So the way it works is usually it's an extended deposit structure. So instead of putting 20% down, for example, right now, and then purchasing the property in 3 months, you may only have to put down, for example, 5% in 2025, 5% in 2026, 5% in 2027, all the way up to 20% over 4 to 5 years of time. So that's where that extended deposit structure could make a lot of sense. And then you'll want to be closing typically 3 to 5 years. So that's where, depending on where you're living or that situation is, it could make sense from that standpoint of closing closer to when maybe you're retired or back living here in whatever city. Now, the other benefit of purchasing pre-construction is you get to choose your finishes, you get to choose your style, the color of floors, color of cabinets. And right now, more than ever, and this may continue for 2025, is the builder incentives are quite high right now. And knowing what those incentives are, and we do have access to pre-construction properties all over Ontario, and in fact, even in Florida and different areas. So it is something where knowing the builder incentives and trying to get the best price possible on platinum access, certainly something that will give you a better pricing than in the future. Just keep in mind that that pricing is still considerably more expensive than on the resale side, at least at the moment. Now, there are things to consider when purchasing pre-construction. As you can see, the list is longer than the other list that we just saw. One thing I cannot stress enough is to purchase with a reputable builder. Purchase with someone who's done this over and over again and has the reputation of getting buildings completed, because that's super important. There will be most likely some delays. I say possible delays. It's very rare that the property is done exactly on time, but just factor in some delays. There are some development charges to be mindful of, and that's where knowing where you can cap those development charges and what you're allowed to do with that property between, for example, now and closing. Can you assign the property? Can you sell it? Now, this video is not going to talk about what's happening on those markets, but it's just an idea that you will want to know some of the ins and outs of the contract. And central locations are generally more expensive than resale. And as mentioned, that's about a 40% premium right now, which is the cost for future pricing. Now we take a look at the pre-construction condos. Basically, right now we're seeing about $1,400 to $2,300 a square foot, and that's definitely on the high side. So if the condo is 500 square feet, you could do the math on what that would look like. On the resale side, right now we're looking somewhere between $900 and $1,100 a square foot. So that's quite the difference when it comes to pricing. And this is something to definitely consider if you are looking to purchase a property. Where is the best value and the best product for what you're looking for? The cheaper locations, so if you do see those pre-constructions that say that are at a bargain price or seem too good of a price to be true, they're typically not as central locations. And there are many sites outside of Toronto. And when they say pre-construction in Toronto, they're actually typically factoring Hamilton through Durham, which is like almost a 2-hour driving radius. It's quite big. But if you're looking, for example, CN Tower, Toronto Central, the price per square foot will definitely be on the higher end. We'll close out here talking about timeline. And the one question I always ask is, when do you want the keys in hand? So if you are looking for something to purchase during the off season, we generally are about a 3 to 6 month process. And what that looks like is you kind of want to work backwards from keys in hand. So starting off with pre-approval, getting approved for how much your budget is and getting all your financing in order. And that's where knowing all these different elements from the pre-approval side and what you need from your financial planner, from your accountant, all those things definitely come into play. And it is February, so there's also elements of taxes and things like that to be considerate of. Then we start the property search, showings, and that could take some time. Depends on how the market's trending, depends on the product type that you're looking for and the location. There are properties in any market in the city of Toronto that are always a pretty hot commodity. So there, and if you watch the channel, there's lots of stuff that I talk about of properties that are hotter than others. And generally, if you are looking for one of those properties, the search may take longer than whatever property is not selling as quickly at the moment. Then you have an accepted offer. We have a few days for conditions, and then typically closing 30, 60 to 90 days. Really depends on the status of who's living in the property. Have they found something yet? Is it vacant? Is it tenanted? Did they need a longer closing? All those elements. And from there, prepare for next steps, get everything ready for closing, keys in hand, and then there's the timing to set up the property. And that could take a little bit of time if you got to go shopping, buy the furniture, deliver the furniture, all that kind of stuff. So that's typically what we call a 3 to 6 month process from conversation to moving into the property. And that could always change drastically, but definitely depends on someone's current timeline and what that looks like for you. So there you have it. You can see double of me there. I'll just cover myself up there. That's easier. Overall, I hope that answered a lot of questions. You could scan this QR code if you did want to have a discussion of where to start. I'm happy to help anybody out when it comes to this and at least provide you whatever information I have and connect you with if you are looking in different markets or just wanted to bounce some ideas. Happy to have those conversations anytime. You can just scan this QR code on the screen or click on the link down below. Book into my calendar anytime. I'm happy to help. I've been through this myself, and I know what that was like, and definitely trying to pass along that to other players looking to get that information for sure. So hope you enjoyed that, and if you ever have any questions, definitely shoot me a message. I'm Michael Ouzas. Thanks for watching.